Welcome back to the channel and welcome to the next episode of the Modern Classic series. This is a big one because it's in collaboration with Michelin as part of my Michelin Mission series, and today, together, we're bringing you the Big Daddy, the original hypercar, some might say, the Bugatti Veyron. Now, when we hear the words Bugatti Veyron, it's almost a disservice because over the years, I think those headline figures of it being, at the time when it launched, the world's most expensive new car, and of course the headline top speed figure of 250 miles per hour. But actually, it's the things that you don't see with this car, the story, the engineering, and everything that was part of that in terms of the team that was behind this car that really made it truly special and ultimately ended up being that flagship hypercar that has been so incredible over the last 15 years. So first of all, let's highlight some of the history and fantastic components of the car, and then we're going to take you out for a drive in this wonderful machine. So these days, we've become pretty blasé with the figures that surround both supercars and hypercars, but back when this was launched, nothing fitted the brief that was given to the engineers to design this car. So it was predominantly instigated by the late chairman of the Volkswagen Group, Ferdinand Piëch. And the brief on paper was actually quite simple. The car had to do everything. But in order to achieve that, the engineering exercises involved were incredibly complicated. So what do I mean by everything? So it had to do over 406 kilometers per hour. I'll touch on why that number is significant shortly. It had to be over 1,000 horsepower, which is why the Veyron is actually 1,001 horsepower. That one is a tip of the hat and gesture to successfully executing that brief. And importantly, it had to do 0 to 62 in 2.5 seconds and be as good on the road as it was on the track. And this is where things get really impressive. It had to take you from the track in the day to the opera house in the evening on the same set of tyres, regardless of if it was dry on the track and then you ended up driving gracefully to the opera house in the wet. But back in 2005 when this car launched, it was groundbreaking. I believe when I tell you the story of this, and we can take tyres for granted, but I think just the story of these tyres almost underpins the entire ethos of the rest of the car. Okay, so I just mentioned a pretty random number, which was 406 kilometers per hour. Well, in miles an hour, that is around 250 miles an hour. But the importance of 406 was that was the top speed that the Porsche 917 achieved at Le Mans in the 1970s. So it was the belief of Ferdinand Piëch that unless this car exceeded the top speed of that car from the 70s, that the evolution of automotive supremacy and technology hadn't actually evolved that much. So that was why that number was so important. When we go for a drive shortly, I will touch on all of the incredible engineering marvels that has made this car possible, but everything about it, the 1,001 horsepower, the active aero, the fact that this has 1,100 pounds-feet of torque. It was the groundbreaking twin-clutch gearbox which launched in this car, which allowed it to accelerate with such linear pull. But all of this, all of the fancy traction control and braking and aero, all goes through this single component, which is, of course, the tyre. Now, tyres inherently, they can be a bit of a boring subject, but this tyre is unlike anything that was ever invented before it, and there has never been anything like it ever since, even on the Bugatti Chrion. That's why this car is so special. At the car's top speed of 250 miles an hour, and in fact during ultimate testing this car achieved over 260 miles per hour. The outer extremities of the tyre are subject to 3,000 G, which effectively amplifies the weight of anything from the centre of the wheel point to the external circumference of the wheel and tyre 3,000 times its own weight. Now, the last thing you want to be doing at doing 250 miles an hour is have any sort of deviation in tyre pressure. So what was developed for this car was a very, very small and lightweight tyre pressure sensor The reason being that during the simulation of the development of these tyres, which by the way had to be done on an aviation rig because there was no car rig at that time which was able to simulate tyres spinning at 250 miles an hour, the centrifugal forces of the tyre would rip the pressure sensor from within inside the tyre wall out of the tyre wall. So it doesn't take a genius to work out that a blowout at 250 miles an hour would be slightly disconcerting. So just this tyre alone had to solve problems which never even existed, stopping components to let you know if your tyre was losing air from ripping itself apart at 250 miles per hour. It was a system which was developed so that if you did get a puncture, you were still able to run the car at up to 50 miles an hour with effectively a flat tyre. It was the first ultra high speed run flat tyre. The average time it takes to make your average car tyre at the manufacturing stage is around about 30 seconds. The average time it takes to manufacture this tyre of the Bugatti Veyron is around about 1 hour. And so there's rumours and prices that fluctuate every time you research the expense of these tyres, but you're not going to come away with much change from around about £20,000 for a single set of tyres. And that's because they are a one-off, they're specifically made for this car, and ultimately, as I mentioned, regardless of all of that power and incredible engine and aerodynamics and everything else involved, all of it goes through this single contact point right here. Fun fact, if you do want to swap your Veyron tyres, you can't exactly send it down to your local garage. You have to take the wheels off, send them back to the Bugatti Chateau in Molsheim, France, upon which the Bugatti engineers will fit and importantly bond and glue the tyres to the rim. The reason being, with 1,100 pounds-feet of torque through all four wheels, during launch control, you might get an ounce of slip, which would ultimately affect the way that the tyre is bedded onto the rim. So everything about this car is just completely next level, and I think that's what sort of quantifies this car as a hypercar. A lot of it is the details that you actually don't see. I mean, just take the story of the tyre. Amplify that level of engineering and story and research across every single component of this car, and all of a sudden, £1 million doesn't seem too bad. All right, before we go for a drive, let's just highlight some other mind-blowing facts and figures around this car, starting with something you wouldn't typically talk about, radiators, of which this car has 10 of them, and it takes 15 hours to build one of them. Everything about it is function, and then it just so happens to look awesome off the back of that. Yes, 10 radiators. What does that mean? What does that translate to? So engine is a W16. That's a W16 cylinder engine. That's how it developed its 1,001 horsepower, 1,100 pounds-feet of torque. Fun fact, Ferdinand Piëch originally wanted it to have an 18-cylinder engine, but when it came to it, I'm not sure if it was a cost thing or a weight or a balance issue, but they effectively stuck to V8s together. That's how they created it, and then it quad turbocharged it, not twin, quad turbocharged it. All of that generates a ridiculous amount of heat. The car actually, despite the fact on paper it ultimately generates a usable 1,001 brake horsepower, the engine actually generates 3,000 horsepower. It's just that the other 2/3 are lost from heat, which is why the car has 10 radiators, which has a surface area of many football fields just to keep the car cool. Pretty convenient. Brakes. At the time, they're the largest carbon ceramic brakes in the world. The car can stop from its maximum speed of 250 miles an hour to a dead stop in less than 10 seconds. Just factor that around your mind 1 second, right? So it will stop faster than it will accelerate, and at the time it was the fastest accelerating car on the planet. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that all of that effort is just through the brakes alone, but it is actually in conjunction with this massive active aero wing at the back here, which I shall share with you once we're actually out and about driving. Just this wing here, which actually, compared to some modern day active aero wings, actually isn't that big. It's deep, so it's got some fairly substantial surface area. But this aero brake here alone, I think around about 125 miles an hour, if you slam on the brakes, it goes up almost vertically, and it contributes up to 1/3 of additional drag towards the braking system, which effectively feels like you've applied the brakes and then someone's gone and thrown out a parachute at the same time to sort of drag you to a standstill, which is why it can go from 250 miles an hour to stop in under 10 seconds. At full chat, the Veyron, I'm laughing because the words which are about to fall out of my mouth are hilarious. At full chat, the engine will consume 47,000 litres of air per minute. That's about the average consumption of a full-grown man every 4 days, just to let this thing breathe. Bonkers stuff. And what supercar expose would be complete without talking about the exhaust, of which it is made from titanium, both for weight saving and heat dissipation, and that is shrouded by, actually by modern day standards, a fairly conservative diffuser, yet it is all made of carbon, and that channels air out from underneath its perfectly flat bottom floor. And once again, there's all mesh here for further heat extraction. And then if you sort of lean back and look under far enough, you can get the impression of just how wide they are. Some of the widest tyres ever fitted to a production car at 14.4 inches wide. Enough talking, let's get in and find out what it's like to drive. Breathtaking is the phrase of the day. Good God, that is savage talk. You know what's... where do I start with this thing? I mean, what's absolutely mind-blowing is that the car is 15 years old. And while in some aspects the world of supercars and hypercars is certainly caught up, the base platform of this is absolutely astounding. I think what's most impressive is just how usable Bugatti managed to make the stats, which I'm once again about to share with you. So, I mean, this is as usable as a Bentley. In fact, that's what it feels like. It feels like a hyper Bentley. That's the sort of first feeling which I'm getting as soon as I'm behind the wheel. It's incredibly friendly. In what world can somebody make 1,001 horsepower and 1,100 pounds-feet of torque friendly? I mean, it's as usable as a Bentley. And actually inside it's nicer. It's so beautiful. Now, interestingly, the ride is stiffer than I sort of expected it to be. Now, I say it's interesting because despite the fact that when you approach this car and as you read about it on paper and its fundamental layout, massive mid-rear engine out back there, it looks like a more conventional sports car or supercar. But in actual fact, the way it drives is much more like a savage Grand Tourer, and that's why I'm a little bit surprised that the suspension is quite stiff, although ultimately this thing has to take control of physics like nothing else that came before it. Being able to hit the track, do 250 miles an hour, destroy a cross-continental cruise, and then when you got to the end, you might want to nip out for a sophisticated dinner with your better half. This thing had to do all of those things. So on the one hand, it had to control physics when you were going around a track, and then on the other hand, it had to control physics when you were going in a straight line, punching through the air. Like so. I mean, I'm really fortunate in this line of work that I have driven the majority of very fast supercars. But while things like, I don't know, the McLaren 720S, that is fast by conventional cars, this thing picks you up and it sort of creates its own vacuum in the air in front of you and punches you through the environment. That's what it's doing. It is punching through the air, not so much as accelerating. It's this magnetic force sucking you down the road. It's incredible, but its greatest trick, I honestly think, is this. This is its greatest trick. The fact that I can pilot hypercar platform with one hand, fairly quiet and relaxed. I can stick on a beautiful sound system and just elegantly waft along, destroying a continental cruise in refinement that you would struggle to find in the likes of a Bentley. It's absolutely outstanding. So I think in this world of hypercars which is out there right now, it's easy to forget and overlook that everything that this car does has been subjected to the rigorous testing of the Volkswagen Group. So what a Volkswagen Golf does in terms of it being a all-round usable daily car, this has to do exactly the same thing and everything else that it does, which is why at the beginning of this video the brief was simple but insanely difficult to achieve. It was so hard to achieve that when the brief was passed around the engineers who were going to be involved in this project, the majority of them said it couldn't be done. That's how hard it was. And yet here we are, 15 years later. What makes this car truly special is that this is the foundation upon which the Chrion was built. Yes, the Chrion is faster, it handles better, it probably does everything that this does a little bit better. But if it wasn't for this car and this foundation, the Chrion simply would not exist. Now, in today's engineering problems, I recently spent time in an Audi RS6 that has around about 600 pounds-feet of torque. 600, this has double that. And the engineers in 2020 said that it would be difficult to make it run as a daily driver with a twin clutch gearbox because, quote, the torque levels that run through it would mean that a twin clutch gearbox would have to be over-engineered, be a lot more expensive, and therefore make that car more expensive and compromised. In 2005, when this car launched, it had a twin clutch gearbox dealing with 1,100 pounds-feet of torque and over 1,000 horsepower in 2005. And don't forget, that's when it launched. The chances are that that gearbox came to fruition in around about 2002. The engineering in this car is otherworldly. Now, we can take it for granted right now, but this car and this gearbox made its way down to other Volkswagen and Audi Group products. So any twin clutch gearboxes that you now might find in the likes of an Audi S3 or a DSG in a Volkswagen Golf, the R&D ultimately came from the Bugatti Veyron. It is a tech tour de force. What we are rolling in is engineering history. If it wasn't for this car, the amount of things which wouldn't exist are crazy. Take the tyres, run flat tyres. Now, run flats were being developed, but not to the extremes that this car demanded. And so other supercars and high performance cars that needed Michelin run flats wouldn't have been able to have them without this car. Battleship of torque. And it handles too. Now, I was really fortunate when I drove the Chrion to have driven that up Jebel Hafit out in Abu Dhabi. And granted, while I'm on some beautiful Cotswold roads now, I don't have anything to quite compare the agility and dynamics of it back to back. But one thing I will say, for a car that is ultimately quite heavy, the agility is astounding. And the way it feels, I mean, it's really reassuring. Quite quickly after the first few miles, you forget what you're in terms of how expensive and how special it is. And that's really important because it gives you a lot of confidence to really drive it and exploit it and figure out what the car's all about. I mean, the steering weight is fantastic. And the brakes, I mean, as I touched on earlier, you can go from 250 mile an hour to dead stop in 10 seconds. So just try and imagine the pressure on my eyeballs when I hit the brakes. It hurts the end of my nose. The way that all of my cells go towards the front of my skull. The way it sheds off pace is absurd. There is a reason that this thing is a stuff of legend. It's not hearsay. It backs up everything it says it does. And when you actually experience it for yourself, 10% more. It's just outstanding. If you didn't know, you would get into this car now, today, after driving all of the latest, greatest supercars, and just take it for granted that this launched yesterday. That's how it feels. It's still that good. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Ciao.